Today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression, primarily in the United States, though we're going to be talking about its international ramifications to some extent, and we'll be talking about its effects on other countries, especially Germany, very shortly when we get to those sections. But for today I want to talk about the general problem, the general economic situation, the general legal situation that it brought about, and the sweeping changes in American society that resulted. The Great Depression was something that had a gigantic impact on people who lived through it. My own parents were children at the time, but my grandparents were adults trying to cope with making a living while they had small children at this time. It's affected my life in significant ways because their attitudes affected me. I am the sort of person who is obsessive about certain things, and in some ways that traces back to the Great Depression and the habits my grandparents taught me. For example, I can't pass by a pencil or a pen anywhere on campus without picking it up. Why? Because, well, I have no pencils and pens in my office. Actually, I have a lot of them. A lot is like, wait, this is useful, okay? And I can't let anything go to waste. I remember one time, actually, near the end of his life, my grandfather was eating some cheese from the refrigerator. It was looking pretty nasty and smelling pretty nasty. Although actually all the cheese he liked smelled nasty from the beginning, from my point of view. But anyway, it was really, and he took a bite of it and said, yeah, this isn't very good. And my cousin was there, and he said, Grandpa, it's okay, you can waste it. And I rarely saw my grandfather get angry. But that was one moment when he got angry. He said, no, I can't waste it. Can't waste anything. And that was an attitude that came from the Great Depression. You see here in this photograph a line of people extending all the way around the block for a chance at a job in order to apply for a job. The building for rent, entire building, nothing there. It was a time of tremendous economic slowdown when huge numbers of people's lives were affected dramatically. Here are three of the key figures in thinking about the Great Depression and the lead up to it. On the left there, Calvin Coolidge, who was president during the 1920s, a time of great prosperity. He voluntarily decided not to run for re-election, though he could have. In the middle there is his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, who gave the person on the right maybe the only good advice he ever got about the Great Depression. The person on the right there is Herbert Hoover, who was elected to the presidency after Coolidge, and the stock market collapse, the subsequent depression, started on his watch. Here you see Hoover in the middle with Coolidge on one side, and actually I don't know who that is on the other side. And here you see Hoover on his inauguration bench. Coolidge and Hoover couldn't have been more different. They in fact hated each other. Here they are driving along to Hoover's inauguration. Coolidge, the outgoing Republican president, Hoover, the incoming Republican president. And as you can see in the photograph, they're not looking at each other at all. They in fact despised each other and were very different in their economic and other political philosophies as well. So it really was based on a deep disagreement between the two men. In any case, the Depression was a time of huge hardship for vast numbers of people. This photograph is one that Roy will talk about in much more detail later. It became symbolic of the suffering during the Great Depression. In this case, it's called Migrant Mother, a mother of several children who had migrated from Oklahoma to California and was looking for work. The stock market shows in dramatic form what happened to the economy. You see throughout the left part of that graph what was taking place from the recession after the First World War in 1921 and 1922 to a dramatic rise all the way up through 1929, and then a sudden fall. Now, the famous stock market collapse in October of 1929 is actually just from the very peak to that point just below the peak. And so, when you look at the overall map, it's not that bad. The initial stock market crash was small potatoes compared to what was to come. Really, it just wiped out the immediate preceding year's gains. Things were still at a very high level compared to what they had been in the early 20s. But then you can see what happened over the next several years, and by the fall of 1932, the stock market was down to about 10% of what it had been. And so think about that for a moment. People's livelihoods were not only dependent on this, because lots of companies' welfare depended on it, everybody's investments were tied up in this. Not everybody's, but lots of people's investments were, and they went down to 10% of their original value within a 3-year time. So think about what that means. People had been saving, they had been investing, And then 90% of what they had saved, what they had invested, what they were building up as a nest egg was gone in a relatively short period of time. Well, things bounced back eventually, as you can see, but it took most of the decade of the 1930s to regain even a majority of that, and then rather unstable. Here's what happened with unemployment. It soared from around 4% to a high point of 25%. People have joked, a recession is where your neighbor loses his job, a depression is where you lose yours. And in this case, well, 25% of people unemployed. That's a huge amount of unemployment. Consider that we thought of the economy over the past few years as not very good. Unemployment has been ranging between, let's say, well, just below 6% to about 9% in this recession that has been, well, that started a number of years ago. This is something that dwarfs anything that any of us has ever experienced. And so it's a kind of economic calamity that in the United States we have not known since then. This is an indicator of what happened to gross domestic product, which is a measure of overall economic activity in the United States. A trend line there is marked as the straight line, but you can see what happened throughout the 1920s. It went from a rather low start up quite dramatically until about 1928 or 1929, then a dramatic fall. And it began to rise by the late 30s, but it was really only the ramp up to World War II that got things anywhere back to normal. Now, how did this come about? Here you see another of these lines. Here, a place offering free coffee and donuts for the unemployed. And people would line up for blocks for this sort of thing. How did it come about? What were the causes of the Great Depression? Here is a cartoon at the time trying to ask this. Our giant, what ails him? U.S. prosperity, sitting there. And you see all these people around saying things like, he's sound as can be, he's just resting, he's okay, he's just taking a rest, he needs a rest, his heart is all right, nothing wrong with him, etc. People at the time were astounded and did not understand what was happening here. That was true of the leadership. People within the Roosevelt administration, later especially, admitted we had no idea what to do. We didn't know what the cause was, we didn't know what the solution was. We were taking any idea we could think of and tossing it and seeing up on the wall, seeing if it would work, and then implementing it and seeing what would happen. Nobody really had any idea at the time what was going on. Well, the stock market crash itself was part of the story. It got this rolling, but it wasn't that big a part in a way. It became fashionable after a while to think of the entire 1920s prosperity as something of an illusion, a house of cards that was swept away in the Great Depression. But actually that's not right. There was a 45% increase in real productivity. So a lot of the gains during the 1920s were real gains. They were real goods. The advances in manufacturing, mass production of, for example, Ford automobiles, which had been earlier built by hand and suddenly were mass produced in factories, that did improve people's standards of living dramatically, and so there was a huge and real increase in wealth. On the other hand, there was also a vast increase in the money supply. And so in addition to the real increases, there were some houses and cards being built, no question about that. And there was an especially large increase in the money supply in 1928, which helped to set up the immediate conditions, the skyrocketing of the stock market, but then its collapse. But there were a lot of other reasons. There were a lot of bad foreign loans, and we're going to come back to that. Countries were loaning other countries money in a way that was irresponsible. A lot of people were buying stocks on margin. That is to say, you, in effect, put money down, but you don't pay the full purchase price of the stock. It is a way of greatly increasing your gains. For example, suppose you put down only 10%, and then the stock doubles. Well, instead of doubling your money, you've actually gone up 20 times. So it can be fantastic. However, there's also a downside. If that loses money, in fact, if the stock loses even 10%, it wipes you out completely. And so it's a very dangerous, very risky thing to do. In addition, once, especially in 1928, everybody started talking about stocks. In fact, one very wealthy person said, I sold all my stocks the day I walked in, and the new secretary I had just hired was there talking about her latest investment. And I thought, wait a minute. If somebody I'm paying a very low wage to is putting her money in the stock market without really knowing what she's doing, that means people are getting irrational about this. And indeed, that was happening. Speculative funds were created that had no real assets. It was a sort of situation where people would basically everybody was making so much money in the stock market, people began to sell mutual funds that really weren't worth anything, taking in unsophisticated investors. Everybody was sort of jumping in without knowing what they were doing. Well, the crash wiped out a lot of this. It wiped out that full year of gains going up before it. On the other hand, within a few months, half of it was recovered, and so it was a sharp correction, to be sure, but it wasn't obvious that it had to lead to a depression. And in fact, if we look at it here, we can say the crash was, well, really just in this broader picture, that part that I've marked in a dark color there. That's not just a one-day thing, but what happened, in that immediate period of a month or so, that's bad. But look at what happened later. It was really the decline in the couple of years after that was so devastating. What brought that about? Well, there are a lot of things you can say. Some people have said, for example, the recession was inevitable. That the prosperity had gone on long enough, and indeed, there's this sort of biblical thing, 7 fat years, 7 lean years. It does seem as if most economic expansions, after about year 7, start slowing down and petering out. So you might think, gosh, 7 years plus 1921, that means 1928, things were getting irrational and about to peter out. So this is just part of the business cycle, and you might think that's what was going on. It was bound to happen. But what happened to turn that recession, which might have been inevitable, into a depression? Well, there's really no consensus about that. And so we've got to look at a variety of theories. Now, unquestionably, there were a lot of policy decisions being made by leaders in the United States and all over the world. Some of those were good decisions, I think. Some were bad decisions, but it's very hard to tell which are which, because after all, none of them were having isolation. They were happening at the same time. Very hard to isolate the effects of any particular decision. And there were also dramatically different effects in different countries. Some countries bounced back from this shock quite quickly. Others took a long time. The United States actually took a really long time compared to other countries. But as we'll see, there were lots of foreign bankruptcies as well. There were many countries that were worse off than the United States. So some were better off, some were worse off. That makes it hard to assess what the Depression was really all about as well. Unquestionably, it led to a lot of suffering for a lot of people. But how are we to understand it? And that's important, not just historically, but so that we can prevent this sort of thing from happening again. As you can see, people not only had an incentive to stay in the cities and try for jobs, but to move to other parts of the country where they thought there were better opportunities. Here you see people jumping on board a train to try to get to somewhere where there might be jobs. Well, there are 3 main interpretations in the economic literature about what caused the Great Depression. This is the first. It was expressed first by John Maynard Keynes, part of the Bloomsbury Group, remember, who in 1936 published his general theory. And it remains an influential theory in economics. He described the cause as market failure. That is to say, this was a failure in the free market. It was a failure in the free enterprise system, in capitalism, if you will. And he assessed the Depression as resulting from insufficient demand. People had money, but they weren't willing to spend it. And why weren't they willing to spend it? Well, basically, he thought there were a variety of reasons. He thought, to some extent, it was animal spirits. People were themselves depressed. They faced risk. They got very risk averse. They were not willing to, venture, not only to start up businesses, but even to spend the money they had. And so the government, instead, should spend in order to counteract this. If private individuals aren't willing to spend money, and so the economy is slowing down, maybe government can spend money and take the place of these private individuals and spur things again. In fact, he had a view that each dollar spent by the federal government would have a multiplier effect. That dollar would go to someone who would then in turn spend it, and that person would spend it, and so forth. And so it would actually have a much greater impact on the economy than just the amount of money the government itself was spending. Anyway, this remains a popular view. Here's a second view. The main people behind this are Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, who wrote A Monetary History of the United States. And their view is known as monetarism. It goes something like this. This was really a Federal Reserve thing. During the Progressive Era, under Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Reserve Bank was created to try to stabilize things, prevent financial panics. But actually, they didn't at the time know very well what they were doing. In fact, really, until Friedman and Schwartz, nobody had the data to really understand what was happening with the monetary side of the economy. And so they permitted a drastic decline in the supply of money. In fact, a 30% decline in just a few years. So take a look at the stock market decline from October of 1929 to the fall of 1932. That corresponded to a cut in the money supply by almost 1/3. And that's dramatic. Basically, the government was taking a huge amount of money out of the economy, not through spending or cutting spending or anything like that, but just in terms of the Federal Reserve loaning money to banks, and in other ways supplying liquidity for the system. Well, the result of that really was that banks failed, banks had to raise interest rates, there was in general much less money around, that meant there were fewer jobs, and in short, that it was really a Federal Reserve failure to not control the money supply properly. And indeed, there's a lot of factual basis for this. There was a great contraction in the money supply. It really did fall within a period of just over 3 years by a third. In fact, over a third if you take that slightly larger period thinking. And so it was a dramatic decline in the money supply, the money available to people to buy things, to hire workers, to do a variety of other things. And here you can see it in graphical form. The money supply there was increasing moderately throughout the 1920s, but then falls dramatically from 1929 to early 1933, and then it begins to pick up again. There's a third interpretation of the causes of the Great Depression. It is the Neoclassical Theory. It basically says it wasn't market failure, it wasn't just, at any rate, a Federal Reserve failure, it was a government failure. The government intervened in the economy in ways that were actually damaging. What did it do? Well, it kept wages high. And indeed, this was, as we'll see, part of Hoover's conscious policy. He thought people would be depressed if their wages fell, so he had a variety of programs to try to keep wages high. But what happens if there's less money in the economy and we try to keep salaries from going down? There are fewer jobs, right? I mean, for the same amount of money, you could either have the same number of people be paid less, or you could have people paid the same, but many fewer people being paid. And that's essentially what happened. So on this view, put forward by John Bates Clark classically, but then in more recent form by Friedrich Hayek, this is something that was just a mistake. Instead of allowing everybody's wages to fall along with prices, which were falling at the time, they tried to keep wages high. That was great if you kept a job, but not at all great if you didn't. Also, government spending, they argued, actually channeled things to less productive uses. It took money that people would have used in other ways, spending it on a variety of things of great value to them, and transferred it to spending on things that were other than that. In general, the argument here is from the neoclassicists, that doesn't help the economy, it hurts it. It takes money that would have been spent in a more productive way and channels it to a less productive use. Well, there was another big factor, which is that FDR, throughout his presidency, attacked businesses. And in general, with his constant policy changes, created a great deal of uncertainty. That uncertainty created risk, and when things get risky, people are less willing to hire workers, they're less willing to make investments. In short, it slowed things down just by the policy changes and the rhetoric, making everyone more risk averse. Well, in any case, there are a variety of videos that talk about these and present arguments for or against some options. The one I really want you to click on is the first one. It is awesome. It is Fear the Boom and Bust, a Hayek versus Keynes rap anthem. And it's really funny. I'm not going to take the time to show it to you now because it goes on and on. But it really is very awesome, and it's very well produced. The people in it are actually economists, but it was produced by a serious video production company. In fact, one of the professors who was in it came home that night and told his daughter, "Yeah, I met this really nice girl there. I thought she was just, like a production assistant, but it turned out she was waiting to do the next video." And the daughter said, "Who was she?" She said, "She had some funny name. Kesha." Well, anyway, but it really is very slickly produced. It's awesome. So look at that yourself. But then there are lots of others where Milton Friedman presents his case, where Amity Schley's gives her view of these various things. Then there are a number of stories that take a more Keynesian approach. In any case, those are worth looking at, well worth your time. Now, let's talk about a few of these things in a little more detail. Wages and prices. Hoover was a progressive. In that way, he was very different from Coolidge. Coolidge was a laissez-faire. Keep government out of the economy. Government's job is to create this framework for liberty, but then it should step back and let people pursue their own ends in their own way. And so he argued for a kind of minimalist government, not quite as minimalist as you could have, because he did think investing in infrastructure, basically, was a good idea, but otherwise you shouldn't interfere. That was not Hoover's view at all. He was an engineer by trade, and he wanted to use government in order to accomplish great things. He was the guy who envisioned great projects and wanted to, in a sort of Wilsonian way almost, bring about, you might say, good social outcomes as a result of government activity. So, he promoted regulations, he promoted a variety of interventions in response to this initial recession. He worked hard to keep wages and prices high. And a good example of this was the Davis-Bacon Act in 1931 that was an attempt to keep wages high. It's still in effect. It says that anybody working on a federal project must be paid the prevailing wage, which really the prevailing union wage. And so it was a way of guaranteeing that government projects would use union workers and keep wages on government projects high. That keeps spending high, but Hoover was basically in favor of that. He also thought keeping wages high would be a good thing. On the ground, that psychologically it's hard to accept it when you get a salary. On the other hand, since there was less money available, it inevitably led to unemployment, and he really had no idea what to do about that. By the end of Hoover's presidency, he really rarely left his office. He was in a constant state of depression. And people who worked in that administration said it was as if there was a black curtain that had just descended over the White House. Things got worse and worse. No one had any clue about what to do. Hoover did something else that actually almost all of the economists from any of those three categories would have said was a serious mistake. He raised taxes. There's an old Keynesian idea that basically when the economy heats up, you should slow it down by raising taxes. When it gets depressed, you should cut taxes to increase the amount of money that people have in their pocket. Hoover did exactly the opposite, and as we'll see, Roosevelt followed him and did more of the same. He raised taxes very sharply. The top tax rate went from 25% to over 60%, to 63% just a few years later. And that's something that had a big impact. It took money out of the economy, out of people's pockets, and especially out of the pockets of the wealthy who could have used it to invest things, start new businesses, etc. He instituted a corporate income tax for the first time, initially just below 14%. It is today 35%, so it's much higher now, but still it had the effect of taking money out of businesses and making it harder for them to hire, harder for them to invest. The estate tax was doubled. That's the tax imposed on you when you die. There was also a tax on every single check. That made everything more expensive, and so it depressed economic activity across the board. But he did believe in big public projects, the most famous of which is the Hoover Dam, pictured here. If you've never visited it, it is really impressive. It created Lake Mead and really is what provides water to Las Vegas. There it is from an aerial view. But now, there was one other thing that had a devastating effect during the Hoover presidency. That was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. And there they are, Smoot and Hawley. They were two congressmen who were behind this idea of raising tariffs, making it harder to import goods. Their thought was this: look, times are tough. A lot of Americans are losing their jobs. Let's encourage people to buy American. Let's make it harder to buy foreign goods, and let's try to keep jobs within the United States. It's a rhetoric we still hear on all sorts of occasions from all sorts of people in different parts of the political spectrum. But in this case, it was widely thought by the economics profession to be a disastrous move. In fact, 1,028 economists wrote to Hoover urging him to veto this, saying that it would be disastrous. Thomas Lamont, a partner at J.P. Morgan, an investment bank in New York, said this in 1930: I almost went down on my knees to beg Herbert Hoover to veto the asinine Hawley-Smoot tariff. That act intensified nationalism all over the world. And indeed, it did have devastating effects. As we'll see, in particular on Germany, but not just Germany, it did devastate international trade, and that lots of countries could not pay their bills. So you see here the New York Times headline: over 1,000 economists asked Hoover to veto the pending tariff bill, but he didn't do it. He signed the bill into law. And the result was a disaster. Here we have to go back to the ending of World War II. Wars are devastating in many ways. The one we think of, obviously, is that they cause huge loss of life. And indeed, remember that more than 16 million people died during World War I. But that's only the beginning. Wars are also really expensive. They're expensive to run in the sense that it costs a lot of money to pay soldiers, to equip them, to manufacture weapons and so forth. But then, of course, the war causes all sorts of devastation. Things have to be rebuilt, and that too is enormously expensive. Well, the Treaty of Versailles required Germany and the other Central Powers to pay what they considered war debts to the Allied powers. And Germany was in no position to repay it, couldn't afford any of this. The United States and the United Kingdom refused to forgive these debts. They insisted that they be paid. But since Germany had no money to pay them, what are you going to do? Suppose one of you, let's say, I don't know, I get some sort of judgment against one of you. This was terrible. I should use this example for myself, because I'm not going to sue a student. I can't imagine what would happen to make me sue a student. Although my daughter did say, finally, one of her most troublesome students has been thrown out of the school. But that student was a fourth grader who kicked the assistant principal in the face. So maybe we could go with that example. One of you kicks me in the face. I sue you because you broke my nose or something. And you have no money to pay me. So what can I do? Well, in the real world, there's nothing I can do. However, in this case, basically, England and the United States said, no problem, we'll loan you the money to pay us back. Okay? Now, for a while, that actually worked. They floated large loans to Germany and the other countries with massive war debts, and that enabled them to pay back what they owed on their previous loans. But you can probably see this is not the way to prosperity. Suppose you run up a huge credit card debt, and somebody says, no problem, just take out a big loan to pay off this credit card. You're just getting yourself deeper and deeper in trouble. And that was what was happening here. Now, here's the thing. The only way these countries had of repaying the money was to actually make money through international trade. But when trade shut down, their avenue of being able to pay back the loans shut down too. And so the result of that was a series of government defaults. Here you see Wilson and the other leaders at Versailles putting together the treaty, or here, in this case, celebrating having done it. But in fact, it was very bad. And it floated along as long as it did only because of this. Dawes was the financial secretary who came up with the idea of the loans. And it was very clever in a way. The United States loaned $2.5 billion to Germany, who paid $2 billion back to the Allies in reparation payments and debt payments. The Allies paid the United States $2.6 billion in war debt payments. And so it seemed to work out well for everybody. The US, notice, took a significant profit out of this. But that kept things going for a while. However, once trade began to decline, and here is the decline shown on one sort of graph. Here it is on another graph. Here it is on another. But you can see the decline from the level in 1929 to the level by 1933. International trade stopped. Well, no, it stopped exactly, but was 1/3 the level it had been just 3 years earlier. So 2/3 decline in international trade. That is huge. And the result was a series of national defaults. Bankruptcy of Hungary, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Peru, El Salvador, Ecuador, Germany, Bulgaria, Colombia, Panama, Nicaragua, Paraguay, Romania, Yugoslavia, Cuba, Guatemala, Uruguay, Poland, Italy, Turkey, and on and on. Okay, so over the decade, more and more countries simply went bankrupt. And there was no way to repay the debts, the reparations, everything else as a result of the treaty. The result was massive unemployment. Here in the United States, but also throughout most of the developed world. Now, really, what was it like to live under these conditions? I've entitled this slide, A Tale of Two Grandfathers, because it affected my two grandfathers very differently, and it illustrates the result of a policy of keeping wages high. Here's grandfather number one. He was all dressed up going to his high school graduation one day. He was riding a bus in Pittsburgh. And this guy on the bus sees him and says, young man, you look nice. Why are you all dressed up? He said, I'm going to my high school graduation. He said, you must be very proud. How would you like a job? He said, okay. And so my grandfather worked for 50 years for the B&O Railroad. Okay? Never was unemployed even for a day throughout the Great Depression. The railroad did well. Wages were kept high. He was fine throughout the Great Depression. had no real problems, hardly even remembered it as a significant episode in his life. Well, yeah, there may be other reasons why I didn't remember much about it. This was my paternal grandfather. He had a mild heart attack at age 89, and he was shoveling snow. He went to the doctor, and the doctor checked him out and said, "You had a heart attack. What were you doing?" He said, "Well, I was shoveling snow." The doctor said, "You shouldn't be shoveling snow, a man of your age. Let some teenage kid in the neighborhood do that. You can't shovel snow at 89. That's crazy. So cut that out." And then he said, "Let me ask you some other questions. Do you smoke?" And my grandfather said, "Well, only cigars and pipes." And he said, "Well, that's bad for you. Stop that." He said, "Do you drink?" I go, "Well, some. How much?" "Well, a 6-pack of beer before lunch. A bottle of Canadian Club in the afternoon." The doctor said, "That's terrible. That's terrible. Cut that out." So anyway, that may explain why I didn't remember much of the 1930s. But it also could be that, life was good. My other grandfather, on the other hand, was a plumber. He had his own plumbing business. And what happens during the Depression when nobody has money to pay a plumber? Well, they try to fix things themselves, or they just do the best they can. It was a time when a lot of people had outhouses still anyway, and they just postponed that plan to have an indoor bathroom and so forth. So he was out of work for much of the Great Depression. The family survived because there was enough land right next to the house that he was able to grow a garden, so they ate lots of onions and cabbage and potatoes and things like that from the garden. He would walk, gosh, how far would it? Something like 8 miles every day to downtown Pittsburgh to the unemployment office to stand in a line like that, hoping there would be day labor that day. He had a car, but he couldn't afford to register the car, even though that was a relatively small fee. Then he would walk home and do that every single day. So for him, it's something that had a huge impact. Now, that was part of the problem. If wages are kept high and you keep your job, awesome, prices are falling, you're better off. But if you lose your job, then you're in deep, deep trouble. And since no businesses are expanding, nobody's spending money on anything, there's no way to get back into the system. What happened as a result of that is a lot of people moved. And so here you see a camp in California where people have moved and are just living out of their cars. They managed to get to California. They had no idea what to do next. They were in these sort of refugee camps. And were just doing the best they could, living out of their cars, looking for work. Here you see a family in such a camp. This was also the time of the Dust Bowl. The 1930s, in addition to these other problems, were, well, a time of great drought, an incredibly warm period. The decade of the 1930s was the warmest decade on record. You will hear from a lot of people, "Oh, recent years are the warmest on record." It is not true. If you compare the original temperature readings, they're much higher in the 1930s. And you can see the effect. Large parts of the Midwest were simply converted into a dust bowl. The drought meant that the land was incredibly dry, nothing would grow on it. It turned into dust, it was swept around by windstorms. And so here you see a child out there in really just this dust. I think this child is in Oklahoma. Yeah, insert OU joke here. But here you see a farmer who is trying desperately to figure out what to do since there's no rain and all his crops are dying. You see people in the cities gathered to try to get work and figure out what to do. Here you see a dust storm blowing into a community in Texas. Here you see the aftermath of such a storm. Notice that was a car. It's now mostly buried under dirt that was blown in by the storm. And here you see an iconic photograph that Roy, again, will talk a lot more about, of people seeking shelter from one of these dust storms. Here's someone driving into it, or maybe away from it. There it is as it hits a neighborhood. And again, there are camps left in the aftermath. That is the photograph I showed you earlier of people in one of these migrant camps, fleeing the Midwest, fleeing the dust storms, trying to get away to a better life. Well, this also had a huge impact on African Americans, and this is a time of great migration. Many blacks left the South at this time and moved to northern cities in search of work, and in most cases, well, unsuccessfully, since the conditions in the city were also bad, but they were better than they were on some of the farms, especially those affected by the Dust Bowl. So here you see families who were In some cases, fleeing the Depression, in other cases, managing to hang on despite it. Here you see the inside of a house, wallpapered with newspaper. Well, it was in this kind of setting that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president in 1932. Roosevelt had been a governor of New York. He was somebody who was enormously wealthy himself. He was also very magnetic personally. He had a tremendous amount of charisma. He had fireside radio chats that helped to unify the entire country and that did a lot to support people's spirits. And here you see the outcome of the election. Roosevelt took 57% of the vote. Hoover won only a few states in the Northeast. And he immediately set to work. As soon as he took office in March of 1933, he ordered a 4-day bank holiday, as this indicates, embargoed gold, basically made it illegal for Americans to hold gold, and called together Congress and began what became known as the 100 Days of dramatic changes in the law. Now, there's a photograph of him with a little girl. It's a rare photograph because he's actually shown in a wheelchair. President Roosevelt had polio and could not walk, but it's very rare that you can actually see him in a wheelchair. Almost always that is disguised so that it's not very obvious. In his Commonwealth Club speech given in San Francisco in 1932, he outlined his general philosophy, and it does involve a radical change from the past. He said our task now is not discovery or exploitation of natural resources, or necessarily producing more goods. It is the soberer, less dramatic business of administering resources and plants already in hand, of distributing wealth and products more equitably. The day of enlightened administration is come. So his idea of what the government should do is not primarily create a framework for liberty and prosperity, as Coolidge had thought, nor is it really bringing about great things in the way that Hoover tried to. Instead, it was to engage in redistribution. There's enough stuff, basically, Roosevelt was saying. It's the job of government to distribute it more fairly. And so that became his idea of what government was really all about. He argued in favor of an economic declaration of rights. And what did he mean? Well, he meant that people ought to be viewed not just as having a right to life, liberty, and property, but a right to a job. He says everybody has a right to life. That means he has a right to make a comfortable living. He may refuse to exercise it, but it can't be denied. Everybody has a right to a job, and he argued in general that people have a right to be cared for if they can't care for themselves. In philosophical terms, these kinds of rights are known as substantive rights. Substantive rights in that they actually are not just rights that other people not mess with you. The right to life is basically a right that other people not kill you. A right to liberty is that other people must not imprison you or restrict your freedom. So they must not interfere with you. These are different. These are positive rights. They suggest that other people have to do things for you. And so he says, no one should go unfed, unclothed, or unsheltered. We have duties to feed, clothe, employ, shelter other people. This is really ultimately a matter of social justice. So what do these involve? Well, here are at least possible examples. Rights to housing, rights to health care, to employment, to food. Those are the kinds of things Roosevelt talked about. And notice that they impose burdens on others. Other kinds of rights, like life, health, liberty, and property that John Locke talked about, aren't like that. My right to life doesn't really force you to do anything. It just tells you you must not do certain things. But these aren't like that. You have to do something. You have to house people. You have to give them health care. You have to employ them. You have to give them food, and so on. And so these are of a very different sort of character. Well, as a result of this reconception of government's role, government spending nearly doubled under Roosevelt in the 1930s. That's one graph showing the pattern of spending during the 1930s. But you can see it maybe if we take it back to 1920 and see how the 30s differed from the 20s in terms of amounts of government spending. You can see a sharp increase there by the middle of the 1930s. And this is a broader picture that goes from 1900 up to the outbreak of World War II. You can see a huge, really government spending at a very low level until what? What is that huge spike? World War I, exactly. And then as you can see, it actually falls back down under Coolidge and Hardin, but to a level that's still way higher than it had been before the war. It increases slightly throughout the 20s, but then dramatically in the later 30s under Roosevelt. Well, Roosevelt's policies are known as the New Deal. Undoubtedly, that's familiar to you. But what did the New Deal really involve? Actually, there were two New Deals. The first New Deal, implemented in his first term, and then a second New Deal in the second term. And they were quite different. It did involve a vast increase in the size and in the conception of the role of government. Government now became a different kind of thing. It wasn't there just to set the general rules of play and enforce them and let then all the players play and make the moves they wanted to make. Instead, it was something that was to adjust the outcome of the game. And that is a very different and much more intrusive conception of government. So, what did he do? Well, in the first 100 days, the Emergency Banking Act, it declared a bank holiday. That's a nice way of saying the bank shut down so that nobody could withdraw their money. And it was an attempt to try to keep the banks from failing. He also abandoned the gold standard. In fact, made it illegal for any private individual to hold gold. I mentioned my grandfather's. The one who had the really tough time during the Depression at one point near the end of his life showed me. He opened up this little box in his sock drawer, and he showed me a $10 gold coin. And he was very proud. He said, they came to collect the gold, but I wouldn't give them this. Okay, he had hid it for all those years. But that's really what happened. Government confiscated gold in many private hands. It also passed the Economy Act. That is something that is dramatically different from followers of Roosevelt today. It cut government employee salaries and veterans benefits by 40%. Roosevelt did realize that the Hoover policy of keeping wages high at a time of dramatically falling economic activity was a way of really dramatically increasing inequality, having some people be very badly off while others were better off. And he sought to actually bring wages down within the government to something like the level of the prices and the decline that had happened in the consumer price index. There was something that wasn't part of the New Deal but happened to happen simultaneously: prohibition ended. So from 1919 all the way up until 1933, it had been illegal to sell or consume alcohol in the United States. Suddenly, prohibition ended. And actually, in my office, I have a photograph of beer trucks outside the Texas State Capitol, waiting for, I think it was noon on that day, prohibition would end. And they were all there full of beer, ready to rush them into the legislators and have a toast to the end of prohibition. But that did improve people's spirits, no pun intended. Anyway, there were all sorts of jobs programs, infrastructure programs, they were all these alphabet-type programs: the Works Progress Administration, the Public Works Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, Rural Electrification Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and a variety of others. All of these were government programs intended to bring electricity to rural areas, or create a series of dams to control floods and bring electricity to the south, or to, in general, create projects like the project that built the Riverwalk in San Antonio, for example, by having government-employed workers to accomplish public goods. And here you see, actually, there were still, in rural Texas, these REA co-ops that were established during this time. This is how Lyndon Baines Johnson actually built up his political power. He was a congressman in Central Texas who helped to bring about all of the electrification of Central Texas. And here you see people actually doing that, employed by the government. The most controversial part of the first New Deal was really a combination of acts that involved heavy influence in the details of economic activity. One of them was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It kept food prices high. Farmers were suffering because food prices were declining along with the prices of everything else. The idea here was to help farmers by keeping food prices high. But how did the act do it? It took land out of production. It plowed under crops. Farmers had to slaughter pigs and just bury them. They couldn't sell the meat. The result of that was vast hunger in the cities. Farmers, for one thing, didn't really benefit because although they got higher prices for what was left, they weren't able to sell nearly as much and produce nearly as much. It produced widespread hunger in the farms and in the cities. It was hugely unpopular. Why, under these circumstances, would you take hogs when people are hungry and just slaughter them and bury them? Why would you take crops and just plow them under? In any case, it was found unconstitutional in 1936 in a case called U.S. versus Butler, which said this invaded the power of the states. The federal government had no right to tell farmers how much they could grow, how many pigs they could sell, and so on. And really, this was a tantamount to a form of coercion. And that's, I suppose, the famous line, the regulation here is simply coercion. It is the government forcing people to do things and thus violating their right to liberty. So part of it was the federal government doesn't have the right to do this, only the states. But secondly, even then, it's a violation of individual liberty.